After the collapse of the Third Reich, many of its leaders scattered across the globe. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of Jewish deportations, Josef Mengele, the infamous doctor of Auschwitz, and Ludolf von Alvensleben, the police chief in occupied regions of Ukraine, all vanished into South America. Others chose death. Hitler shot himself, and his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, took poison. There were also those whom the victors executed quickly after the fighting had ended, figures like Walter Schmidt or infantry general Anton Dossler. But 24 prominent members of the Third Reich found themselves drawn into a unique spectacle, one in which each man stood alone against the judgment of all humanity. And the stakes were greater than life itself. It was their very purpose, their legacy, their place in history. In this episode, we'll explore how and why the Allies agreed to launch the Nuremberg Trials, how the Soviet Union concealed its own crimes, whether any top Nazis managed to escape execution, and ultimately, what the court decided regarding Bandera. But before we begin, remember to like this video. It helps spread historical truth. And of course, make sure to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. At the end of World War II, a new conflict emerged among the Allies, not over whether vengeance was needed, but over what form that vengeance should take. The Soviet Union demanded a swift, theatrical trial with predetermined sentences, just as it routinely imposed on its own citizens. The British were even more blunt. They wanted executions without any trial at all. The United States insisted that there must be a real tribunal, public, evidence-based, and one that allowed even obvious criminals a chance to speak. Only this, they argued, would reaffirm the rule of law. The Americans persuaded the British, and the Soviets were forced to accept the idea. Thus, the Allies reached an agreement. The world would witness a trial in which humanity, for the first time, demanded accountability for crimes on such a massive scale. France had little influence over these decisions. The country was still recovering from German occupation, and its place at the tribunal was essentially the result of diplomatic compromise. The USSR hoped the French would side with them against the Anglo-Saxons, while the US and Britain expected France to be another Western ally. Moreover, having France, a nation once conquered by the Reich, at the table was meant to show that the tribunal was truly international, not merely a court of victors judging the defeated. At the London Conference, the Allies agreed to hold the tribunal in Nuremberg, the very place where the Nazis had gathered for party congresses and passed their anti-Semitic laws. 24 architects of terror, ministers, generals, bankers, ideologues were to sit on the defendant's bench. The main criteria for selecting them were their role in decision-making, the extent of their involvement in carrying out those decisions, and the availability of evidence against them.
The defendants were to be tried on 4 counts: war crimes, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy, the framework that had made all these crimes possible. During World War II, the Soviet legal scholar Aaron Trenin developed the concept of a crime against peace, meaning the planning and execution of large-scale military aggression. This idea was accepted in the West and became a cornerstone of modern international law. The Soviet delegation demanded that the Nazis be prosecuted for mass extermination of civilians, deportations, shootings, and genocide. American prosecutor Robert Jackson proposed a different formulation, the crime against humanity. It was meant to be not just a legal judgment, but a moral condemnation of Nazism itself. The tribunal's jurisdiction was limited strictly to crimes committed during the aggressive war, because both the USSR and the United States wished to avoid any international scrutiny of Stalin's repressions or America's Jim Crow racial laws. The London Conference concluded with the signing of the Nuremberg Charter, the legal foundation of the upcoming tribunal. It marked a revolution in the old order. Responsibility was placed not on states, but on individuals. Only the upper echelon of the Nazi regime would face prosecution. The list of defendants, published on August 29, 1945, was imperfect and incomplete, a flaw that would later influence the trial. Each of the 4 countries appointed one judge and one prosecutor. The British selected the experienced Geoffrey Lawrence, someone who irritated neither Washington nor Moscow. Measured, reserved, and free of political baggage, he was the ideal compromise figure in a courtroom where the Allies trusted one another only slightly more than they trusted the accused. The USSR sent veterans of Stalin's show trials, Judge Iona Nikitchenko, his deputy Alexander Volchkov, and prosecutor Roman Rudenko.
They were puppets of the Kremlin. Every word they uttered had to be approved at the highest levels. The central figure of the prosecution was the American attorney Robert Jackson, the architect and chief coordinator of the entire trial. He led the U.S. delegation, negotiated with the Allies, and oversaw the collection of evidence. It was Jackson who delivered the opening statement, declaring, "We are holding back the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submitting captured foes to the judgment of the law." It became one of the most powerful examples of the tribute that force has ever paid to reason. Defense lawyers for the Nazi leadership were chosen from among German attorneys who had no ties to the Nazi Party. Most had no experience in international law, let alone in facing an international coalition of the world's best jurists. And yet, the formalities were honored. Each defendant received properly appointed legal representation. Thus, on November 20th, 1945, the trial began. But 3 of the 24 defendants never appeared in the courtroom. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, was tried in absentia. He was already dead, though the Allies did not yet know it. Gustav Krupp, the Reich's chief arms manufacturer, was excluded due to incapacity after several strokes. And Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, broke into hysteria upon receiving his indictment, begging for execution because he could not face the tribunal. Ley managed to commit suicide in his cell before the trial even began. During the proceedings, the prosecution presented 4,500 pieces of evidence, including sworn testimonies, torture devices, the diaries of Goebbels and Himmler, 25,000 photographs, and 30 kilometers of film reels. The most shocking moments came from the horrific footage of mass shootings, the liberation of concentration camps, tortured prisoners, mass graves, gas chambers and crematoria, and the medical experiments of Dr. Mengele, who had escaped justice.
Reacting to the evidence, Goering mocked the proceedings, dismissed the charges, and insisted the photos were staged. Ribbentrop looked stunned. Rudolf Hess appeared indifferent, and Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, burst into tears. Journalists who saw the concentration camp footage for the first time covered their faces with their hands and left the courtroom. The central villain of the trial, the final symbol of the Third Reich, became Hermann Goering. At Nuremberg, he defended his actions to the very end and continued justifying Nazism. On the margins of the court documents, Goering scrawled contemptuous lines: "The victor is always the judge, the vanquished the accused." The climax of his confrontation came during the March cross-examination. Robert Jackson pressed him hard, hoping to break him quickly with evidence, but Goering counterattacked. Confident and precise, he maneuvered through every detail and blamed the interpreters for misunderstandings. Agitated, Jackson violated procedure by demanding that Goering answer only yes or no. The court refused. At that moment, the American was backed by Britain's Maxwell Fyfe and Soviet prosecutor Roman Rudenko, who continued the interrogation and systematically dismantled Goering's arguments. Some write history, others ensure it is never forgotten. These are the guardians of our channel. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, acknowledged his guilt and the monstrous nature of Nazism. His defense boiled down to a single claim: Keitel had merely followed Hitler's orders and had no political will of his own. But the tribunal rejected this. The orders authorizing the execution of prisoners of war and mass reprisals bore Keitel's own signature.
His case became the embodiment of a fundamental principle. Carrying out criminal orders does not absolve one of responsibility. Publisher Julius Streicher spent 20 years using his newspaper, Der Stürmer, to systematically fuel hatred toward Jews, calling them spawn of the devil and urging the so-called cleansing of Germany. At the tribunal, Streicher pretended to be a harmless lover of nature and culture who supposedly only wanted foreigners to leave his homeland. When the court proved his guilt, the Nazi dropped the facade, hurled insults at those present, and denounced the proceedings as the triumph of world Jewry. One of the most grotesque spectacles of the trial unfolded around Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, who fell into British captivity in 1941 after attempting, on his own initiative, to negotiate peace. In Nuremberg, Hess claimed he didn't recognize the defendants and couldn't remember his life in Germany, but medical experts declared him sane. He later admitted he had been faking memory loss, yet he continued behaving like a madman, avoiding people, showing no emotion, then suddenly erupting into hysterical laughter. In his final statement, he declared, "I regret nothing. If I had to begin again, I would do the same, even knowing I would perish at the stake." Hess's mental state remains the great enigma of the trial. Reich Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop expressed no remorse, but he made an unforgettable revelation. He publicly referred to the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, the conspiracy between the USSR and Nazi Germany to divide Eastern Europe.
A copy of the protocol could have served as proof of the USSR's complicity in starting the war, but without the original document, and given Moscow's denials and the West's unwillingness to provoke Stalin, the subject was quietly pushed outside the tribunal's scope. Instead, Soviet prosecutors presented forged evidence blaming the Nazis for the Katyn massacre of 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals, a crime actually committed by the NKVD in 1940. But thanks to witness testimonies, the truth became clear. Although the case was excluded from the final verdict, this omission effectively acknowledged the Soviet Union's responsibility. Conversely, documents from Erich Koch and Alfred Rosenberg portrayed Bandera as an enemy of the Third Reich. The tribunal acquitted 3 defendants. Hjalmar Schacht, former Minister of Economics, had lost influence before the war, cooperated with the resistance, and after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler, was imprisoned by the Gestapo. Franz von Papen, who had helped pave Hitler's path to power, was himself targeted during the Night of the Long Knives. Jailed, his secretary murdered, his associates executed. After that, he essentially withdrew from political life. Hans Fritzsche, who oversaw radio and press in Goebbels' ministry, escaped conviction because prosecutors failed to prove a direct link between his broadcasts and genocide. Later, a denazification court sentenced him, but he was released under amnesty and died 3 years later of cancer. The Soviet side rejected the acquittals and demanded the gallows for everyone. Iona Nikitchenko even filed a separate judicial opinion, openly disagreeing with the tribunal's verdicts. He also protested Hess's life sentence, calling it far too lenient. 12 defendants, including Göring, Keitel, Ribbentrop, and Streicher, were sentenced to hang. Göring and Keitel requested execution by firing squad as soldiers, but the tribunal refused. The method of execution was meant to underline that they were not warriors, but criminals. Yet Göring managed to take his own life with cyanide the night before the hanging. Keitel and the others were executed according to the verdict.
Alongside Hess, 6 more defendants received life imprisonment. Hess spent the rest of his life trying to cast himself as a martyr. He died 3 decades after the tribunal, the last surviving Nuremberg defendant. The tribunal's decisions were later codified by the UN International Law Commission as the Nuremberg Principles, which introduced, among other concepts, the idea of an international crime, one that recognizes no borders and has no statute of limitations. These principles served as the foundation for later international tribunals, including the Tokyo Trials, as well as the proceedings for the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. The International Criminal Court may also be seen as an heir to Nuremberg, the same court that, as you know, has issued an arrest warrant for, well, you know who. Decades after Nuremberg, the world once again finds itself staring into the face of darkness. The principles proclaimed in 1946 still await their full enforcement because even today there are those who believe themselves above international law. So tell me, who do you think should be sitting in the defendant's dock in the 21st century, and for what crimes? Let me know in the comments.